Welcome to the Candlelight Historian. Today we journey back to the year 1212 to unravel one of the most tragic and misunderstood events of the Middle Ages, the Children's Crusade. Did thousands of Europe's youth really march to Jerusalem and die? The story we've been told for centuries is a haunting one. An army of innocent children, led by shepherd boys with divine visions, setting off to reclaim the Holy Land with faith alone, only to meet a horrific end. But what if I told you that story is mostly a myth? That this was never really a crusade of children? That one of its leaders may have survived to become a soldier in an official war? And that the father of the other boy prophet was publicly hanged by grieving parents after the disaster? Today we separate fact from fiction. This is the tragic Children's Crusade of 1212. Myth versus reality. First, let's revisit the powerful legend that has captivated us for over 800 years. The story begins with two charismatic boys. In France, a shepherd named Stephen of Cloyes claims that Jesus, disguised as a pilgrim, has given him a divine letter for the king. In Germany, a boy named Nicholas of Cologne announces that an angel has commanded him to lead a new crusade. Their message was radical. Where the great armies of sinful knights had failed, an army of the pure and innocent would succeed. They gathered a following of up to 30,000 people, mostly children, and began a long march south. They were driven by the fervent belief that the Mediterranean Sea would part for them, just as the Red Sea did for Moses, allowing them to walk to the Holy Land. But the miracle never happened. And here, the story turns dark. The legend tells us the children were tricked by two merchants who offered them free passage on 7 ships. Instead, they were either shipwrecked in a storm or sailed to North Africa and sold into a lifetime of slavery. It's a powerful, heartbreaking tale of innocence betrayed, and it's almost entirely a work of mythistory, a potent blend of historical events and legendary fiction. The first and most shocking fact is that this was probably never a children's crusade at all. The confusion comes down to a single Latin word used by the original chroniclers, Pueri. For centuries, this was translated simply as boys or children. But modern historians, most notably Peter Rates, have shown that in the 13th century, Pueri was a social term. It meant the wandering poor. These weren't just children. Contemporary sources describe a mix of children, adolescents, women, the elderly, the poor, and even some petty thieves. The Pueri were the landless, the uprooted, the destitute, who lived on the absolute margins of feudal society. Their status as Pueri was less about their age and more about their complete lack of power and property, a dependency like that of a child. This single mistranslation changes everything. The movement transforms from a naive march of kids into a desperate pilgrimage of the dispossessed. It was a social explosion fueled by poverty and hopelessness. The name Children's Crusade was cemented decades later by writers who either misunderstood the term or, more likely, deliberately romanticized the story to make it a more powerful moral lesson. The German movement, led by Nicholas of Cologne, gives us the clearest picture of the brutal reality. Nicholas, a boy from the Rhineland, began preaching at the famous Shrine of the Three Kings in Cologne Cathedral. He too promised the sea would part. A vast host of the poor gathered and began the trek south across the Alps. The journey was an unmitigated catastrophe. One chronicle grimly states that 2 out of every 3 people on the journey died. Of the tens of thousands who started, only about 7,000 straggled into the Italian city of Genoa. For our listeners in the UK and Europe familiar with medieval history, the accounts from German chronicles are chilling. The Chronica Regia Coloniensis, or Royal Chronicle of Cologne, written shortly after the events, captures the initial bewilderment. In this year occurred an outstanding thing, and one much to be marveled at. Many thousands of boys, ranging in age from 6 years to full maturity, left the plows or carts they were driving. Suddenly, one ran after another to take the cross. They briefly replied that they were equal to the divine will in this matter. The chronicles describe barefoot marchers facing the chilly Alps, with dozens freezing to death each night from exposure. Weak from hunger, they left the bodies of the dead unburied in the frozen mountain passes. When the survivors finally reached the coast at Genoa in August 1212, they faced their great test of faith. The sea did not part. For many, this was the final blow. But for others, the crusade ended in an unexpected way. The booming city of Genoa needed labor and offered citizenship to any who wished to stay. Many of the desperate paupers accepted, transforming their failed pilgrimage into a successful, if harrowing, migration to a new life. Nicholas, however, pressed on to Rome with his most loyal followers. There, Pope Innocent III praised their zeal, but formally released them from their vows and told them to go home. And here, we find another shocking fact that shatters the myth. Nicholas did not perish in Italy. Some chronicles suggest he survived the journey home and was later seen fighting in the Fifth Crusade in Egypt. But his story, and that of his family, ends in tragedy. Nicholas himself likely died on the second brutal crossing of the Alps, and back in Cologne, the grieving and furious families of the children who had died following him seized Nicholas's father, held him responsible for the disaster, and had him publicly hanged. The French Crusade, led by the shepherd Stephen of Cloyes, is where the legend truly takes flight. Stephen claimed Jesus had appeared to him as a pilgrim and given him a secret letter for the King of France. The king dismissed him, but Stephen's charisma was undeniable. He gathered a huge following, and later, more romanticized accounts say he traveled not on foot, but in a gaily decorated cart with a canopy to shade him from the sun, treated like a living saint by his followers. After a grueling march south, his followers also reached the Mediterranean at the port of Marseille. And again, the sea did not part. It was at this moment of crisis that the villains of the story appeared, two merchants, given the allegorically evil names Hugh the Iron and William the Pig by a later chronicler. They offered to transport the remaining faithful to the Holy Land on 7 ships, free of charge, for the glory of God. What happened next is the most infamous part of the legend, but it rests almost entirely on the testimony of a single, unnamed priest who claimed to have reappeared 18 years later. He told a horrifying tale. 2 ships were wrecked in a storm off the coast of Sardinia, killing everyone aboard. The other 5 were deliberately sailed to North Africa, where the merchants sold their human cargo into slavery in the ports of modern-day Algeria and Egypt. It's a shocking cinematic story of betrayal. It's also almost certainly an invention, created decades later to give a neat, tragic ending to a messy and uncertain event. So how did a complex social migration of the poor become a simple, tragic tale of lost children? The answer lies with the men who wrote the history, the monastic chroniclers. For our listeners in Britain, one of the most important voices in this story is one of your own. The 13th century English Benedictine monk and historian, Matthew Paris. Writing decades after the event in his famous chronicle, the Chronica Majora, Paris offered a strikingly cynical view. He dismissed the entire affair as a foolish error driven by the devil. In a shocking inversion of the myth of purity, he described the boy prophet not as a saint but as a certain child who truly was a child in age and most base in morals. His French contemporary, Alberic of Trois-Fontaines, took the opposite approach. He is the one who transformed the participants into innocent infantes, infants, and crafted the dramatic tale of martyrdom and betrayal. by the evil merchants, Hugh the Iron and William the Pig. These later writers weren't just recording history, they were shaping it into a moral lesson. A story of betrayed children was a more powerful cautionary tale than a complex story of a peasant migration. So what was the final echo of this tragedy? Pope Innocent III, a master politician, skillfully used the disaster as propaganda. He is famously quoted as declaring, "These children put us to shame. They rush to recover the Holy Land while we sleep." He used the unauthorized pilgrimage of the poor to shame the nobles of Europe into funding the Fifth Crusade. And while the chronicles focus on mass death and slavery, a single surviving legal document gives us a more human story. A papal letter from 1220, a full 8 years later, records a poor student named Otto petitioning the Pope to be released from the crusading vow he took as a boy. He is the only participant we know by name from an official record. His story reminds us that behind the grand, tragic legend were thousands of individuals, the paupers, the wandering poor, whose real story was one of desperation, a search for a better life, and a profound faith that was twisted by time into one of history's most enduring myths. And that brings us to the end of our journey into the Children's Crusade. Thank you for joining us on The Candlelight Historian. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, please consider liking this episode and subscribing to our channel. Every subscription helps us to continue digging into these incredible stories from the past and bring them to you. We'll see you next time.